A Hard Day's Night, which the Beatles began shooting as soon as they got back to England, was conceived neither as a regular feature film nor even as an exploitation flick. Strange to say, this much admired comedy, often exhibited today in art cinemas, started off as a scam, a ploy designed to enable United Artists to get its hands on a Beatles album. When the idea was spawned in the summer of '63, Capitol, EMI's subsidiary in the United States, was refusing to release Beatles records on the grounds that they were unsuitable to the American market.
I've made a huge mistake.
UA's executives in Britain, who enjoyed a much better vantage point, were convinced that the day was fast coming when the Beatles would break big in the States. So they proposed signing the Beatles to a 3-picture contract that would automatically entail 3 soundtrack albums. Nobody ever dreamed, even in his most golden slumbers, what riches would flow from this simple suggestion. For with A Hard Day's Night, United Artists got not only the best Beatles album to date, but an enormously popular film, brought in for under $500,000. As UA didn't want to waste money on what was regarded initially as a throwaway item, it engaged Walter Shenson, an independent producer who had demonstrated a knack for making successful little movies on a shoestring like The Mouse That Roared. Shenson was also regarded as a man familiar with the British and theater worlds. The producer recalled,
United Artists approached me and asked me if I'd make a film for them. And I thought they had a script or a book or something. And I said, what have you got? And they said, well, we want to make a movie with the Beatles. I said, sure, I'd be happy to. So they introduced me to Brian, and I guess he thought I was okay. And next thing I do, I had to meet the Beatles. Well, the first meeting I had with him, Brian Epstein was supposed to bring them to my office in London, and he showed up on time, but the Beatles, they didn't come. Brian came, and he apologized. He said, I'm afraid we'll have to do it some other time, but they're over at EMI Studios at Abbey Road in on a session that another group that Brian had managed, so I have to go over there to meet them. So I said, well, can I go with you? And he said, certainly. So we jumped in a taxi, and he said, well, let's stop by their apartment here in London first. And sure enough, they all came down looking for a taxi. So they jumped into our taxi, and you know, London taxis are only for 4, so there's 6 of us in there. And I thought I was in the middle of a Marx Brothers movie. Every time the taxi stopped, they'd grab all the newspapers that had Beatle headlines, which they did. And I asked the Beatles, when could we start filming? And John opened up his little diary, and he said, well, we're going to the Bahamas for a holiday. And then in February, he said, we're going to go to your country. We're going to go to New York and do something called the Ed Sullivan Show. And I said, well, that'll be fine. While you're in the Bahamas, write at least 6 new songs for our picture. And John said, well, what's the film about? And I said, I don't know. We haven't got a writer yet. And he said, well, what kind of songs do we write? And I said, Beatles songs. I don't know, 2 up-tempo, 2 ballads. I don't know, write 6 new Beatles songs. And John said, you have a director in mind? I said, yes, another American over here named Richard Lester. And he said, what has he done? And I said, well, he's done some very good television stuff with the Goons. Now, the Goons were an English comedy group that predated the Monty Python group, and Dick had directed their television, and I knew that the Beatles were Goon fans. So when I said Dick Lester, they said, well, get him. And that's how it all started.
The most critical problem initially was the choice of scriptwriter. Shenson was apprehensive about tying up his brilliant director, Richard Lester, in the toils of some over-realistic script.
We didn't want to make a pop movie. We didn't even want to make a movie if it was going to be bad. And we insisted on having a real writer to write it. And Brian came up with Alan Owen from Liverpool, who'd written a play for TV called No Trams to Lime Street, which I knew, and I think Paul, maybe they all knew. Lime Street's a famous street in Liverpool where the used to be in the old days. And he was famous for writing Liverpool dialogue. And we said, all right, but then he had to come round with us to see what we were like. But he was a phony, you know. He was like a professional Liverpool man, you know, like professional Americans like that. He stayed with us 2 days and wrote the whole thing based on our characters. And that, me, witty, Ringo, dumb, and cute.
Owen took his historic mission very lightly, though he did find time to hop over to Dublin for a couple of days in late '63 to observe the boys at close hand. Then he returned to crank out a script that, whatever its merits as a comic scenario, betrays nothing but ignorance of the Beatles. Though the boys are given a few saucy lines in the familiar scene in the railway carriage, the rest of the picture turns on the character of Paul's grandfather, the clean old man played by TV star Wilfrid Brambell. Not surprisingly, the Beatles were very unhappy about being treated so dismissively.
We were a bit infuriated by the glibness of it, and the shit of the dialogue, And we were always trying to get it more realistic, even with Dick and all that, and make the camera work more realistic, but they wouldn't have it,
They didn't dare voice their complaints to the American movie makers, but their beefs did come to the ears of Alan Owen at Swinging London's favorite hangout, the legendary Ad-Lib Club. One night, while John was sitting at his table talking to the actress Billie Whitelaw, he got onto the subject of Alan Owen. "He's full of shit," stormed John. "He couldn't write his way out of a wet paper bag." When Owen confronted John with these derogatory remarks, John behaved with characteristic duplicity. "Alan, whatever they say, you know I love you, don't you?" he said. "Yeah, but what's all this about me not writing my way out of a paper bag?" persisted the offended writer. "No, listen, Alan," John protested. "She started saying how good you were, so I had to knock you, didn't I? I had to knock you. You pay somebody, you gotta knock him. Nothing personal." All the same, at the film's premiere, John watched one reel and ran out of the theater crying, "I can't stand this lot." Only George remained to the end. If the music for A Hard Day's Night has nothing to do with the script, that is because most of the songs express the soul of John Lennon. The film score coming as close to a solo album as John ever made with the Beatles, whereas the movie is simply a projection of their public image. In fact, the enormous appeal of the image could be taken as prime example to the fantasies of that time. The infatuation with the idea of four cheeky working-class boys, as lovable and innocent as children.
It was a good projection of one facade of us, which was on tour once in London and once in Dublin, of us in that situation together, in a hotel, having to perform before people. We were like that. He saw the press conferences and we were a little... He recreated it pretty well, but we thought it was phony then even, It wasn't realistic enough.
It is the theme of the Beatles as children that explains their epiphany in the film, which comes not where it might be expected, with the band in full cry on a concert stage or in a recording studio, but out of doors, upon a playing field, where the boys perform the juvenile camerabatics suggested by Dazzle Hoffman's famous shot showing all four Beatles leaping into the air at once. This notion of the Beatles as sexless and charming children was particularly dear to the hearts of parental America, where nothing was more common in the year 1964 than tributes to the Fab Four from middle-class mamas and papas, who were relieved to discover that for once their children were losing their minds over pop idols who embodied only the most charming and disarming sort of youthful rebelliousness. Many such parents accompanied their children to the first showings of A Hard Day's Night. How horrified all those mothers and fathers would have been if they could have accompanied the Beatles on their world tour in the summer of '64 and witnessed the scenes of nightly debauchery.
The Beatles tours were like satirical. We had that image, but man, our tours were like something else. If you could get on our tours, you were in, Just everywhere. Satirical, just think of Satirical only with four musicians going through it.
Would you go to a town, a hotel?
Wherever we went, there was always a whole scene going. We had our 4 bedrooms separate tried to keep them out of our room, and Derek and Neil's rooms were always full of junk and knows what, and policemen and everything. We had to do something. And what do you do? The pill doesn't wear off when it's time to go. You just go. I used to be up all night with Derek, whether there was anybody there or not. I just couldn't ever sleep. Like anybody, like they're all into now, but they didn't call them groupies then. They called it something else. But if you couldn't get groupies, we'd have and everything, whatever was going.
Who would arrange for all that stuff?
Derek and Neil, that was their job. And Mal, but I'm not going into all that.
Businessman on the convention.
Oh, sure it was. When we hit town, we hit it, We're no pissing about. There's photographs of me, God knows, they were crawling about in Amsterdam on my knees, coming out of houses and things like that, and people saying, "Good morning, John," and all that, and the police escorting me to the places and things like that. You know, because they never wanted a big scandal, you see. I don't really want to talk about it because it hurt Yoko, you know, and it's not fair. But suffice to say, just put it like, you know, they were satirical and on tour, and that's it, because I don't want to hurt the other people's girls either. It's just not fair. I'm sorry.
I remember John saying of Alan Owen, who was a Welshman who wrote about Ireland and came from Liverpool, the trouble with you is you're just a professional Liverpudlian. And Alan said, well, it's better than being an amateur one, John.
I wouldn't take any credit away from Alan. I thought the script, the first one I read, I thought was brilliant, much too long and much too scripted. But it was great. I don't know another writer who could have been as perceptive as that in the short time allowed.
They did a certain amount of ad-libbing, maybe 5 or 10%, but I've got Alan's script, and all the ad-libs that you think are ad-libs were written by him.
I went to Dick and I said, okay, I want you to make the Beatles movie. And he was very intrigued. He says, what do you think it should be? I said, I don't care. It's your responsibility to decide what kind of movie it is, how to make the boys work. Tell me who you want to hire to write this script. Come back with it, and whatever you do, I'm sure we're going to want to go. So the entire creative input as to what this movie should be and how to maximize the talents of this extraordinary group of young men came from Dick Lester, Alan Owen, and Walter Shenson.